Well, Paul O'Neill spent 2 years as George W. Bush's Treasury Secretary. He was fired at the end of 2002 as part of a shakeup of the president's economic team. After he left office, O'Neill detailed many of his disagreements with the president. For one, he opposed many of the Bush tax cuts. O'Neill says he directly advised the president on multiple occasions against a further round of cuts. Yet President Bush remembers history differently in his recently published memoir, Decision Points. In fact, the president claims that O'Neill only expressed that opinion behind his back. I asked O'Neill to respond.
You know, it's interesting. One of the things he says in the book is that the two of us never clicked. You know, to that I would say, amen. I could never figure out how to have a logical, progressive conversation with him about anything. So it's true, we never really clicked. But he does say that he discovered from others, it got back to him in his words, that I didn't favor the third tax cut. Here's the truth. In April of 2002, in a meeting in his office, in the Oval Office, with me and Secretary Don Evans, who was then Secretary of Commerce, and Andy Card, who was the Chief of Staff, and Karl Rove, and Larry Lindsay, and Glenn Hubbard, who was then the head of the CEA. They were talking about we need to mount an effort for another round of tax cuts, and I said, clearly, I speak clearly, this is not a good idea for these reasons. We've just had 9/11. We could have another one of those. The cost of 9/11, $100 billion. We could have another one of those. There's a conversation about going to Iraq. God only knows how much that could cost. You
weren't supportive of that either.
No. There's a need for fundamental tax reform. There's a need for fixing Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security. And rather than another tax cut, we should use the money you're talking about to deal with these other problems and have some money in case some of these other things happen in terms of attacks and wars in Iraq and things like that. Just as clearly as I said it to you, I said it to him and to all the other assembled groups.
And he says you didn't say that. He said that in a lot of conversations you were talking about workplace safety and things like that.
Margaret, I did talk about workplace safety but that's a different conversation. I talked to him about education and the environment, a whole bunch of other things they wished I hadn't talked to him about. But in any event, I had this conversation with him directly in April of 2002. I had it again in the Oval Office, again with the same group of people in August of 2002. In April, Don Evans actually said, I agree with the Secretary. By the time we got to August, nobody was agreeing with me because to the rest of them, it was clear that the decision had been made. In November, I said the same thing in a meeting in the Roosevelt Room with the President, the same cast of characters, with Dick Cheney sitting on my right, making his famous observation that Reagan proved that deficits don't matter. So for the President to say in his book that it got back to him that I didn't agree with a third round of tax cuts is not true.
Why do you think he would present history in that way?
I don't know. I don't know, but it's consistent with my experience with him.
Which is that the decisions were made, but the conversations weren't listened to, or?
You know, every Tuesday morning, I had a personal briefer come from the CIA and spend an hour with me to let me ask him questions about the intelligence that was being presented, including me saying to them with increasing passion in 2002, the stuff you're showing me is not evidence of weapons of mass destruction. It's allegations from people like Chalabi and others saying that we suspect there are weapons of mass destruction.
It sounds like what you're questioning is not only the evidence there, but it's also the decision-making abilities of the president.
Absolutely.
Have you ever spoken to the former president since you left the administration?
You know, actually I did once. There was an event, a birthday celebration for President Ford in 2004 at the White House. I was really close to President Ford, and I was invited to come to that dinner, and so we exchanged pleasantries on that occasion. Other than that, I have not spoken to him.
You spoke to him that day, though?
I did. You know, he said to me, my God, you look great. That was about it.